The turkey was still steaming when my husband pushed his chair away from the Thanksgiving table and looked at me as if I had just shattered 10 years of his life with one sentence. I had meant it as a joke. A stupid, careless joke made in the middle of a bright afternoon surrounded by family, laughter, and the smell of cinnamon, roasted vegetables, and fresh bread. But the moment I saw the hurt in his eyes, I knew something had changed. He quietly said that if I truly believed our son might be his brother's child, then he wanted a DNA test. The room went silent, and suddenly the holiday sunlight pouring through the windows felt colder than winter. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of families to heal even after painful mistakes, please like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Heart Kindness Tales. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories like this to you. The Thanksgiving gathering had started beautifully that morning. Sunlight filled our dining room, turning the glass ornaments on the windowsill into little pieces of gold. My husband, Orson, had been awake since sunrise preparing the turkey with his younger brother, Calder. I watched the two of them moving around the kitchen, teasing each other the way brothers do, arguing about seasoning and laughing 5 minutes later. Their relationship had always been close, and sometimes that closeness made me feel like an outsider looking into a private world. Our 12-year-old son, Tavian, moved between them, stealing pieces of roasted potatoes and pretending he was helping. He had Orson's habit of tapping his fingers whenever he was thinking, but he also had Calder's crooked smile. I had noticed the resemblance for years, but never thought much of it. The house filled slowly with relatives. There were grandparents, cousins, aunts, and neighbors carrying pies and casseroles. Everyone seemed happier than usual. Tavian sat beside his father, proudly telling everyone about a science project he had completed at school. Orson listened carefully, asking questions even while carving the turkey. I watched them together and felt an old warmth settle inside me. Orson had never been the kind of father who simply provided a roof and food. He remembered every school event, every favorite snack, every little fear Tavian had as a child. When Tavian was 6 and broke his arm, Orson had stayed awake beside him through the entire night, even though he had work early the next morning. I knew how much Tavian meant to him. That was why what happened next was so foolish. After lunch, everyone was relaxed. The adults were talking while the younger relatives played outside in the bright November afternoon. Calder had just returned from the backyard with a plate of pie, and Tavian ran toward him because Calder had promised him the last slice of pecan pie. They stood beside each other, and someone laughed about how similar they looked. I laughed too. Then, without thinking, I made the mistake that would haunt me for years. I smiled and joked that perhaps Tavian was really Calder's son and that we had all been fooled. Several people laughed for a second. Then I saw Orson. His smile disappeared completely. At first I thought he was offended because the joke was inappropriate. I tried to laugh it away, telling everyone that I was only teasing because Tavian had Calder's smile. But Orson didn't laugh. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger alone. It was fear, humiliation, and something much deeper. He asked me quietly whether there was something he needed to know. I immediately told him no, absolutely not. I said it had been a joke and nothing more. But the damage had already been done. Orson stood from the table and walked toward the hallway. He didn't slam a door. He didn't shout. Somehow, his silence was worse. He told me that if I could make a joke like that in front of his family, then he needed certainty. He said he wanted a DNA test. I felt my stomach drop. I followed him, begging him to understand that I had never cheated on him and that Tavian was his son. But he looked exhausted rather than furious. He told me that he wanted to believe me, but once a thought like that had been placed inside his mind, he couldn't simply erase it. The afternoon that had begun with sunlight and laughter suddenly became unbearable. I wanted to take back the joke, but words don't work that way. You can't pull them from the air once they've landed inside someone's heart. The hardest part was watching Tavian notice the tension. He had been laughing outside only minutes earlier, but now he stood in the doorway holding his half-eaten slice of pie. He asked whether his parents were fighting. I forced a smile and told him everything was fine. Orson turned away because he couldn't answer. Tavian looked from one of us to the other, confused and frightened. That night, after everyone left, the house felt enormous. Empty plates remained on the table. Half-burned candles flickered beside untouched desserts. The beautiful Thanksgiving decorations looked almost cruel against the silence. Orson slept in the guest room. I stayed awake in our bedroom staring at the ceiling, replaying that terrible sentence again and again. I remembered every time Orson had held Tavian as a baby. Every birthday. Every school play. Every scraped knee. Every bedtime story. How could one careless joke make all those memories feel uncertain? The DNA test was scheduled for the following week. During those days, Tavian became quieter. He stopped asking about Thanksgiving. He stopped making jokes about his father and uncle looking alike. One afternoon, I found him sitting alone on the back porch in the sunlight, staring at the neighborhood. He asked me whether Dad was angry with him. My heart broke. I told him that none of this was his fault. I told him that adults sometimes say foolish things and create problems they never intended to create. But he wanted to know why his father suddenly seemed distant. I couldn't tell him the truth without hurting him more. So I simply hugged him. When the test results finally arrived, Orson asked me to sit with him at the kitchen table. The same table where we had shared breakfast that morning. The same table where Tavian had once done his homework. Orson held the envelope for several seconds before opening it. My hands were shaking even though I already knew what the result would say. Tavian was Orson's biological son. There was no doubt. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt devastated by what the test had cost us. Orson stared at the paper for a long time. Then he closed his eyes. He apologized for doubting me, but I told him that I understood why the joke had hurt him. The truth was that he hadn't really been asking about biology. He had been asking whether the life he believed in was real. I apologized too. I told him that I had been careless with something sacred. I had taken a private fear and turned it into entertainment without realizing that the person sitting across from me might hear something completely different. Then Calder arrived. He had heard about the test and had spent the entire week blaming himself. He told us that he had always considered Tavian his nephew and nothing more. He admitted that he should have stepped in sooner when the joke was made, but he had been too shocked to understand what was happening. He looked at Orson and said that no test could change the fact that they were brothers and that Tavian was his nephew. Something about those words finally broke the tension. Orson began to cry. Not loudly. Just a few silent tears that he wiped away with his hand. I had rarely seen him cry. He admitted that he had been terrified of discovering that the family he loved wasn't what he thought it was. He said the worst part wasn't the possibility of betrayal, it was the thought that every memory of Tavian's childhood might suddenly feel borrowed. I reached across the table and took his hand. For the first time in days, he held mine. Tavian eventually came into the kitchen, and Orson called him over. He pulled our son into a hug so tight that Tavian laughed and complained that he couldn't breathe. We both laughed through our tears. It wasn't a perfect moment. Nothing had magically erased the pain. But it was real. And sometimes healing begins not when everything is fixed, but when people finally stop pretending that nothing was broken. Months passed. Thanksgiving became a memory we rarely mentioned. But the following year, we decided to host again. The same windows filled the dining room with afternoon sunlight. The same family gathered around the same table. Tavian, now 13, helped Orson carve the turkey while Calder stood nearby making jokes about their terrible cooking skills. This time, when someone mentioned how much Tavian looked like both brothers, I stayed quiet. I simply smiled. I had learned that love doesn't need careless jokes to prove itself. Family isn't strengthened by testing how much pain people can tolerate. It is strengthened by trust, patience, honesty, and the courage to apologize when we have caused hurt. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to Heart Kindness Tales. Sometimes a small mistake can teach us a lesson that stays with us forever, and sometimes the most beautiful part of a family story is not that nobody gets hurt, but that people choose to heal together.